be welcoming Suedeen Kelly. And uh, I tried to pick snippets from Suedeen's bio, and I'm like, "Ooh, this is my favorite part. No, wait, this one's my favorite part." And so I apologize if I'm inevitably going to leave some of it out, but I think the level of work, and to say you have been knee deep getting your hands dirty in the regulatory, kind of the making, the breaking, the building of this. Suedeen is a highly recognized energy practitioner and former commissioner with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And I'm going to break a little bit from the bio, but having served 3 terms under 2 different administrations goes to your level of expertise on some of these topics as well. But she is a partner with Jenner and Block, and through her legal practice now represents a variety of clients in the electric and natural gas industries on business, regulatory litigation, enforcement, and policy matters such as electricity, gas markets, renewable energy. The list goes on. If it's in the energy space, Suedeen is again working with that, and also had noted in your bio that you were recently appointed to the board of the American Wind Energy Association and has served as a chair of energy industry practices at 2 international law firms. So again, very excited to hear about supply chain risk. Welcome and thank you. And a reminder to everyone, post questions, comments, feedback in the question section or the chat. And kind of without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Suedeen Kelly and take it away.
Thank you, Liz. Can you hear me?
Oh, absolutely.
Great, great. Well, it's just a pleasure to be here. And I'm here primarily on behalf of my client, which is a nonprofit called Protect Our Power. It's a nonprofit that's mission is to help increase the security of the electric grid. And they are engaged in a number of activities that I would love to talk about. Uh, on a personal note, I want to share with you a COVID-19 situation. So I am, needless to say, Zooming from my home, and the repairman for my dryer arrived this morning and repaired my dryer. So I was then able to turn on my washer dryer, but he apparently unhooked the drain arm from my washing machine. And so I just discovered 5 minutes ago that my washing machine is emptying all of its water onto my upstairs floor, and it's leaking through the electric lights in my dining room, which is where I am speaking to you from. And I have gotten a bucket under it and I've turned off the lights. So I think everything is fine. But if you hear any strange noises in the background, you are hearing strange noises in the background. It's the water dripping into the bucket. So with that,
I was gonna say, and if you need, if only we were all closer, I could stand there with the umbrella to keep the water off of your camera and with the towels at the ready. So, talking about grace under pressure, we really thank the sacrifices. Hopefully, your dining room table will not be lost for the cause. But
I've
wow.
decided that there's nothing to do except to let the washer drain out through my lighting onto my dining room table. So, I mean, what else am I going to do except watch it? So I'll just ignore it and we'll talk.
Exactly. Well, and it's a good analogy, perhaps, for making the best of the resources and the situation at hand and how you can build from that.
That's exactly right. Um, So to talk about the organization first, the Protect Our Power organization, it is, as I said, a nonprofit, and there are 24 advisors on the advisory committee, and the advisors come from all walks of cybersecurity, from the regulatory side, from the government side, from ex-Homeland Security individuals from those who have had experience on the vendor side. They're all now independent of the industry, but they've had great experience on looking at this problem from different perspectives. The programs that Protect Our Power has been most active with, at least recently, are, as Liz mentioned, supply chain. We actually commissioned Ridge Global, which is a firm that is run by Governor Ridge, to review the power industry's supply chain security risks. And we have done that, and we are working with both DOE, the Department of Energy, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, my former agency, to share the information. And we're working with both DOE and FERC to determine next steps. Both the Department of Energy and FERC are proposing to take steps to better secure the supply chain in the electric industry. It's challenging, and the president recently issued an executive order attempting to do the same thing. It's very challenging because of the nature of the electric industry. Frankly, the electric industry is big and diverse. And when we talk about the security of the grid, we're talking about the security not only of the transmission lines that feed in, that is the grid, but the distribution lines that form part of it, and everything that hangs off of the grid, like electric generators. Now we're seeing storage, battery storage, distributed generators. They all have portals onto the grid. So it's a challenge to figure out, first of all, what should be done. And then secondly, how do you organize all of these different entities to work collaboratively to secure the grid? If you think about the nature of let's just talk about the transmission system across the country. There are several thousand different owners of the transmission system. One of the beautiful things about America's transmission system, which also poses a problem when you talk about cybersecurity, is that it's fully integrated. We have 3 different grids. We have the Eastern grid, Texas, which is its own grid, and the Western grid. And there are thousands of different owners of the pieces of the grid. And each owner, there are 3 different business models. There's investor-owned utilities that own part of the grid, publicly owned utilities like the City of Los Angeles, the Bonneville Power Administration that own pieces of the grid. And then there are pieces of the grid that are cooperatively owned. Some of them are regulated by FERC, some of them are not. The transmission grid is regulated by FERC, but the distribution grid is regulated by the states. So the biggest challenge, at least as I see it, to achieve the cybersecurity of the grid is coordinating all these entities. Maybe I shouldn't say it, it's the biggest challenge. The first challenge is to figure out what you should do. The second challenge is, once you've figured out what ideally you should do, how do you do it? And how do you get all of the owners on the same page to do the same thing? Because although they own separate pieces of the grid is just one entity. I think of it as a big amoeba, and an insecure part of the grid affects the entire grid. So supply chain security is one of them. And as probably many know, the Department of Energy is is in the inquiry stage and looking to pass a proposed rule about supply chain and supply chain security. And it's an interesting question as to what DOE has jurisdiction over. Does it have jurisdiction over the publicly owned owners of the grid? Does it have jurisdiction over the cooperatively owned? Does it have jurisdiction below 100 kV? And that's just starting to play out. So Protect Our Power has been active in the inquiry and will be active in the notice of proposed rulemaking. And our goal is to work with DOE to come up with good protocols, but also with creative ways to get all of the owners of the grid working together. Along those lines, one of the other initiatives that Protect Our Power has been involved in is commenting on a recent issuance by the staff of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the cybersecurity white paper. And the staff was thinking about, opining about ways to give entities that FERC doesn't regulate or have jurisdiction over, or even entities that FERC does have jurisdiction over, to have incentives to invest in cybersecurity and cybersecurity initiatives and to coordinate with each other. I wanted to talk a little bit about other challenges in making the grid secure. And that is, again, comes out of the fact that little pieces of the grid are owned by so many different entities. And if each and every one of them had responsibility for making their piece of the grid secure, there aren't enough resources available for each of them to go it alone. So if you think about 3,000 different utilities trying to come up with their own cybersecurity plan, how are they going to do that? We'd need 3,000 cybersecurity executives who would go to work for each of these utilities and who would devise a plan. And there probably aren't 3,000 of them. And many of these utilities, regardless of the nature of their ownership, are small, have small budgets, likely unable to hire their own cybersecurity executive. Let's say they all did, though. How are they all going to get on the same page? So one of the things that Protect Our Power has been advocating for at FERC and at DOE, and soon on the Hill, is to pass legislation that would enable these separate utilities to form one or several coordinated entities where they would share expertise, share the cost of becoming cyber secure, and be on the same page about what they want to do in the future. So Liz, should I stop there and ask questions, or?
It's up to you. And I've, having worked with a couple of the electric cooperatives on the security side, where I think you kind of truly highlighted, but to really hit the nail, I mean, when you're talking about they're responsible for, power, and we think, okay, yeah, if the power goes out, the lights, but certainly in this audience, understanding the magnitude of no, power goes out, and you have one or two people that's their IT staff. period. I mean, protecting both the systems, the software, the continuity, but also the data.
Right.
And I mean, yes, the fact that y'all are empowering these organizations and giving that voice to be able to, okay, how do we maximize resources? Because admittedly, if it's a choice between, well, you're keeping the lights on, keeping the hospital running, keeping all this from an equipment perspective, or yes, we need to hire another chief data privacy officer to do, it's like, we're gonna have to prioritize.
Right.
So how, eh, having now been kind of on both sides, being the one who's making those decisions, writing those opinions, and kind of guiding it from one side to, eh, how are you finding kind of spreading the message and getting people to say, hey, yes, you're having to, worry about the compliance. Now here's how we're going to do it. Here's how we're going to, because I mean, you've certainly taken one hat and now put on a different one, and it kind of lessons learned, perhaps share some of that too.
So it's a challenge because, I mean, we talk about the difficulty of small utilities finding the expertise and hiring the expertise. Um, the next step is paying for it. Right? And that's where we have the next challenge because if so I'm from New Mexico, and I use the example from my home state. The city of Farmington has its own electric utility, and they own some transmission, some distribution, and some generation. They're small. The city of Farmington has maybe 50,000 people in the general city of Farmington area, and cybersecurity involves becoming cybersecure involves a fixed cost. So if the city of Farmington has to hire a cybersecurity executive and then get the pay for the plan and then invest in the hardware software to make itself cyber secure and invest in the endeavor to coordinate with its neighbors so that it's all doing the same thing. That's a huge cost, and especially spread over 50,000 people. And if you think about it, just compared to Public Service Company of New Mexico, which is New Mexico's biggest utility, which probably has 1 million people in its service territory, PNM probably pretty much incurs the same cost, the same fixed cost. It has its cybersecurity person, it does its plan, it figures out the hardware software it needs to buy, it buys it, probably doesn't end up spending that much money than the city of Farmington. But they have 1 million people to spread it over. So part of this coordination problem is also paying for it. So in a perfect world and in Protect Our Powers perfect world, what we are advocating for is not only the ability for utilities of all different business models and sizes to form a one entity, call it a cybersecurity utility, for purposes of becoming cyber secure over their systems, but then of being able to pay for it by assessing everybody the same amount. Instead of, if you live in Albuquerque, you would pay $1 a month. But if you live in Farmington, you got to pay $12 a month to become cyber secure. It's just the equity of that, and the challenge of that is leading to barriers to becoming cyber secure. So our initiative is, in a perfect world, the industry would try and form this themselves voluntarily. but we probably need Congress to help us pave the way, both in creating a vehicle or allowing a vehicle that could be um, a cyber a one utility for a region, and allowing the cost of that to be spread evenly over everyone. But I think that that's a contribution that Protect Our Power is pretty unique in making, because it's independent. Um, it's not an investor owned or a publicly owned or a cooperatively owned, so it doesn't come from a perspective of trying to protect whatever it has or its piece of the grid. It's really looking to see if we can't get everybody working together on the same page, and sharing resources and paying for them evenly.
Well, as you noted, it's maximizing. It's spreading out the cost, but because the risk is there for everyone. I mean, if one town goes offline, one area, the ripple effect throughout, everything, and it's realizing it's not just an inconvenience that, and especially threat actors, right, and vulnerabilities don't care. Well, we just spent $1 million getting this versus, yeah, we just spent $1,000. Like, well, okay, it's an IoT connected device that's vulnerable. And, again, it's the big cities are getting hit by ransomware attacks, as well as the small counties and, much smaller governments, and that disparate impact uh, from, well, okay, we didn't have the budget. Well, now what? We can't provide these critical resources for our community. So,
Right. And it's a bit ironic, at least to me, when you think about what we started, what we attempted to do, uh, frankly, with the rural electric cooperatives and the creation of them and the empowerment of them, by President Roosevelt during the Depression, is we saw holes in our transmission grid. We didn't have transmission and distribution across all of America. Lots of rural America was not reached by the grid, and therefore by electricity, or at least affordable electricity. And so we embarked on this effort, at which we've been amazingly successful, of having an integrated grid, a Western grid, Texas, and the Eastern grid. Um, but in the planning of the integrated grid, we really didn't think about the fact that we might want to island them. We might, maybe at today, if you have a cybersecurity attack in New York, you could potentially bring the whole Eastern grid down. How are you going to? How do you isolate New York? Can you island New York? So it's, and we've seen this play out in California with the wildfires, right? Where the utilities see a wildfire starting, let's say in outside of Northern California, let's say in Northern California outside of Sacramento. The transmission system wasn't designed to bring down a little piece of it. You got to take down a whole chunk of the transmission system in order to um, isolate an area. We don't have hundreds of thousands of microgrids in the United States. We're talking about doing that so that we can island different sections of the grid, but we don't have that now.
it's certainly a big challenge, and great that y'all are starting to tackle some of this. And we will drop, if you want to make sure, where are some where are places people can learn more about the efforts that y'all are undertaking, and we'll be sure to also post those links in the materials as well.
Sure, it's protectourpower.org is the website, and all the material is there. And I guess we have a few more minutes to talk about some of the other initiatives that Protect Our Power is doing. And one of the initiatives is, in the absence of all the utilities coordinating efforts, we are working with state regulators and the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, which is the trade association, if you will, of state regulators, to encourage the states that have jurisdiction over the distribution systems to have the same policy about cybersecurity of the grid. That's the other thing, right? If the regulators, if there are 52 state regulators of the grid, and each of them has a different cybersecurity policy for the distribution system, it's going to be a long time coming before we become cyber secure. So one of our regulatory initiatives is trying to advance uniform state policies so that we can become cyber secure.
No, excellent. And absolutely avoiding that patchwork of, not only do you have one or two people trying to then protect the entire system, but one or two people having to figure out, well, we also work in this state and that state, and keeping up. So that's excellent. Where else, or what are some of the other things you have on the agenda?
Pardon, I lost you.
Oh, sorry. So what are some of the other priorities that y'all are working on?
The one other priority is that, you mean in cybersecurity?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah. The one other priority is we look at the NERC reliability regulations and the standards, because NERC has jurisdiction over the reliability of the grid, no matter who it's owned by, of 100 kV and above. But the NERC process for coming up with standards is provided for in legislation, and the process is good for coming up with standards, but it's slow. It starts from the bottom up, and there's a lot to be said for that when you're trying to devise standards. And NERC has a suite of cybersecurity standards. But when you think about the cybersecurity threat, there's only so much that you can do through standards, because the threat is a dynamic, ever-changing, ever-moving around threat. And a standards process is always a step behind. And to actually become cyber secure, you have to be a step ahead. So our organization believes that we have fine baseline standards, but the future of cybersecurity is in best practices, in identifying those dynamic practices that are not susceptible to standards, but will change. They may change over the course of a month in response to threats. And ultimately, what we need to do is have every utility commit to following the same best practices and investing in the best practices. So our organization has identified about 50 to 60 best practices that we think would be ideal for utilities to adopt. And we are working with universities. We have eight universities so far that we're working with that has agreed to take one of these standards and identify the vendors who can actually help utilities meet each standard, and then evaluate the vendors' offerings, their hardware, software, in a sense, not certify, but confirm that that their products would achieve the best practices standards, and then advertise that. Because if you think about, there are probably 800 or so vendors of cybersecurity software hardware. If you're a utility and you're trying to figure out what I should do, you don't have the resources to investigate 800 different vendors' offerings and analyze which ones will work for you and which ones don't. So we see this as, um, and this is an effort to provide information, and to provide a certain standard so that vendors can reach utilities, and utilities can learn about which vendors could potentially help them solve their problems. Without such a thing, we expect that most utilities will just default to one company that they know, which may or may not be the best vendor for to solve the problem they have.
No, absolutely. Well, thank you. And I encourage everyone to find out more about the various initiatives. And with that, we're going to wind down our track two. I encourage everyone to jump over to track one if you're not already registered. You should be able to find those links and catch our two closing keynotes. Thank you so much, Suedeen, and
Thank
everyone for
you.
joining. This will wind down track two.